Hello friends and welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Kat and I make videos about books, writing and other random things living rent-free in my neurodivergent brain. Today we're going to talk about the books that I read in July. The only book from my TBR that I didn't read was Mistborn by Sanderson. Then I have a book that I started but did not finish, and that was my research book for my novel. If you don't know, I'm currently working on an adult or new adult fantasy novel, and the manuscript is currently sitting at around 30,000 words. I wanted to read some of the materials that I've gathered to help inform the world building and help me build my story and go a little bit more in depth. So I started that book but didn't make much of a dent in it yet because it's non-fiction, it's quite dense. I'm also not telling you what the title is because I think it would give away a lot about what the novel is about, so I'm keeping that under wraps. I'm rolling it over to my August TBR, hoping to make a bit more of a dent this month in my reading of this book. Next, I have two DNFs. So the first one, surprisingly, is 1000 Words by Jami Attenberg. I started this book back in June when I was doing my 1000 word of summer challenge, and I took it with me on my little writing retreat, which was amazing. It's a book that's composed of a lot of very short chapters from a lot of different authors, and it's basically a collection of the texts that are sent by Jami in her newsletter during the 1000 words of summer. I really pushed through with this book. I think I read about 2/3 of it before I decided to stop reading it and realizing that it was not really the book for me. It's a book about writing, so I really expected to like it and for it to be an easy read, but I felt myself struggling more and more to pick it up, and I think it's just the format that's not something that worked really well for me, like this kind of collection of very short snippets that remain a little bit superficial. I think that's my main criticism of this. There are like a couple of times where I liked what was talked about, like the topics are interesting, but because it's so short, maybe like 2-3 pages max per essay, it doesn't really go that much in depth, and it was not really saying anything really new to me or that was really being like a pep talk to get me to writing. Unfortunately, I've encountered other books with like a similar very short-ish kind of nuggets format, and I'm just starting to feel that it's just not a type of structure that works for me, so I decided to stop this. I think I'm gonna keep it because I might dip in and out of it when I need some inspiration. I might read something, but if after a few months I realize that I'm really not picking it up ever again, then I might let it go. The other book I didn't finish this month is Chouette by Oshetsky. I wanted to read this for the Disability Pride Month that occurs in July. I read very little, like maybe 30 pages only, but just quickly realized that, first of all, it was very, very weird, which I kind of expected from the blurb. It's the story of a main character who's just giving birth to an owl. So it was already a bit left field, but I was quite curious to pick it up. It was just not the right book at the right time, and I think timing is such a major element in whether we enjoy some books. So I would have not been giving this book a fair chance by reading it now when I was just not in the right headspace. Now moving on to the books that I actually finished. There were 6 this month. 2 of them were on audiobooks, and I think I had 2 non-fictions and 4 novels. The first book I picked up this month was Out on a Limb by Bonam-Young, and I wanted to pick this up again for Disability Pride Month in July. It's also a book that my friend Rochelle at Good Morning Dreamer has been speaking so highly about, so I was very curious to pick it up and really hoping to love it. And I'm happy to say that I really enjoyed this read. I think it was extremely cute and well executed. I listened to it on audiobook, and I have to say I kind of binged it. I read it very quickly in a matter of maybe 2 days, And I was doing my miniature one-shop thing while I was listening to this book. And so I've made good progress on my miniature, which I'm quite happy about. This book is about Win and Bo, who both have a limb difference, and they meet at a Halloween party. They both have kind of matching costumes, and that's what sparked the conversation. They have very good banter, they have clearly some good chemistry and attraction, and so this leads to a one-night stand. Obviously, the story doesn't end there, and quickly Win realizes that she's pregnant. So this book includes an accidental pregnancy trope, which is really not my thing, but I think Bonam-Young did a really good job with it, and I was able to pass through that and really get attached to the character, enjoy their story. Even though it was not necessarily my thing initially, I still had a lot of fun with it. I would say that the spicy scenes weren't really my vibe. I felt that their dirty talk was quite cringy, but other than that, it was quite a fun ride, and I really enjoyed it. A bonus point is that there was also some Dungeon and Dragon representation in there, so that was quite fun to discover and read about that. And yeah, overall I would recommend, again, even if you're like me and don't necessarily like the surprise pregnancy trope, I think that was executed in a way that still made the book quite interesting and cute and a lot of fun, so I would recommend it. The second book I read this month, also on audiobook, was Knife: Meditations After an Attempted Murder by Salman Rushdie. In August 2022, Salman Rushdie was on stage to give a talk about the importance of places of refuge for writers and the importance to keep them from harm, when a man dressed in black jumped from the crowd and attacked him with a knife. It was an extremely shocking event, and Salman Rushdie was seriously injured. It's a miracle that he survived and recovered from his injuries. In the process, he lost an eye, and I think one of his hands is also seriously damaged. But overall, he made a full recovery, and it's quite astonishing. So this book details the attack and also covers Rushdie's miraculous physical recovery, as well as his mental and spiritual healing journey. This book was really a gut punch, and I cried multiple times listening to it. Rushdie is narrating it himself, so I would really recommend that you listen to it on audio, because that really enhances the experience. Overall, it's by far the book that impacted me the most this month. It's hard to say that I loved it because of the topic matter, but I think it was, again, incredibly impactful and really shook me. Again, I cried multiple times. I remember having to hold in the sobs when I was listening to it on the bus, and then stepping out. It was something like 30 degrees that day, and I was having chills all over my body because of what he was talking about. And at some point I had to stop walking and step aside, find a corner where I could take my breath and process what I was hearing. So it was very, very intense. If you don't know, Salman Rushdie is the author of the Satanic verses. In, I believe, 1989, he was sentenced to death by the Ayatollah Khomeini, which was at the time the supreme leader of Iran. The Ayatollah proclaimed a fatwa basically saying that Rushdie had to die, and a huge amount of money was offered to the person who would execute him. This means that Rushdie has lived with basically a target on his back for decades now, and it just feels astonishing to me the level of resilience that this man has to be able to live under those conditions. In a way, there's not much that he can do, but he could have kept hidden all of this life, but he kept writing, he kept publishing works and being a public figure. And one thing he talks about in this book is how anachronical it felt when this man jumped out of the crowd to attack him, because it had been, over 30 years by then, and he was just like, why now? Why the attack now after so many time has passed and it's kind of out of most people's mind? I've been aware of Salman Rushdie's work because I've studied South Asian cultures and literature, and so obviously his name came up quite a few times because he wrote some iconic books, including The Midnight Children, about the partition between India and Pakistan. And So I was aware again of his work, of his story, but I never got to reading his books because I've always been a little bit intimidated. It was very interesting to hear a bit more about his life in this book, and again, his resilience, his healing journey, and how he chose to take the outlook of love and how that's the thing that helped him move forward and continue with his life. I would very much recommend reading this book if you feel up for it. It's not for the faint-hearted, I would say. And again, like, I cried multiple times, but it's also very moving. It shows both sides, I think. It shows the worst in people, but also the best. So the hatred, the destructive power that we have over each other, but also the resilience and the love, and how strangers will jump in to support you and help you and try to save your life. It was a very powerful read, so again, I would recommend. Moving on to something a little bit lighter, I finished reading Save the Cat Writes a Novel this month. I don't have much to say about it. It's a book about story structure and how to plot your novel. It's very high quality. It's packed with super practical information and tips. It details the 15 most common bits in a story, so that really helps you kind of create the structure of your novel, but it also covers examples and detailed analysis of 10 types of stories. I really like this. I think it's very, again, helpful and practical. If you're working on a novel, I would highly recommend it. Next, I have 3 novels about which I have a lot of thoughts, so I will try to keep things short-ish, but at the same time, I want to share the comments that I have and hear what other people think about those books. So the discussion might include spoilers. When that's the case, I will flag it somewhere on the screen so that you can skip ahead and avoid them if you don't want to hear them. I will also try to gather all my non-spoilery thoughts at the beginning of the discussion and then maybe have a section where I talk about things in a bit more detail. So I will go progressively into more spoilers territory, but also I think the challenge is that what some people consider spoilers might not be the same. So again, I will try to keep it as vanilla and general in the beginning and then slowly go into more details. And when I clearly into spoiler territory, I will flag it on the screen. I read Yolk by Mary H.K. Choi. I quite enjoyed this when I read it, but surprisingly, I haven't thought about it that much since I finished it. So this is the story of Jane and June. They are 2 Korean-American sisters and they are nothing like each other. They're very, very different and at different stages in their lives. And they kind of don't want to hear anything about the other one. That's until June gets cancer and needs her sister's help. So this is narrated in the first person from Jane's character, and I was actually quite surprised by this because the way it's pitched and the way the summary is written on the back cover really gave me the impression that we would see both sisters equally. So I was expecting a dual point of view narration, and I was also expecting it to be third person for some reason, probably also because of the tone of the summary. So that was a surprise for me, but I still managed to quickly get into the book. And so we are in Jane's head, and Jane is a bit sarcastic compared to her sister. Jane is kind of struggling a little bit. She's in a bit of a toxic relationship with her roommate. She's living in a very dungy apartment in New York, struggling to get through her classes, all of that. So she's kind of not doing very well, and suddenly June starts to come back into her life, even though they've been estranged. And so overall, I enjoyed the experience of reading this book, but Jane didn't feel like a very likable character. So sometimes I was struggling a little bit, but I think the author was very, very talented at the scene level, kind of showing the dynamics that the characters have between them and writing between the lines. So, you know, when you read something and they're not telling things explicitly, but you still understand all that being unsaid. So in summary, I think Mary-Kate Choi was very good at showing, not telling at the scene level. I really enjoyed her writing. I think she had very interesting ways of describing things in a way that's very accurate and self-evident, but you would have never thought of using those kind of words to describe it. So I really liked it. I really enjoyed this book at a micro level. I think the author is very masterful again in crafting scenes and showing the dynamics between characters. Voice is quite strong, the imagery is quite good, so all of that was pretty exciting. I think what kind of fell down a little bit for me was at the macro level, so kind of the whole structure of the book. Overall, I think the book was a bit slow and not so much happens. Maybe slightly entering spoiler territory here, but I felt that Jane's character arc was a bit unbalanced. So it feels very, very slow through 90% of the book, and then everything happens in the last maybe 30 pages. And what the author was doing felt also quite obvious in some places. So in writing, there is this tool that's called nesting, which Mary Robinette Cowell talks about, I believe, in like probably different sources, but I know it's one of the lectures in the ones that Brendan Sanderson has online. He has her as a guest. And so the idea of nesting is that when you start like a B plot, you will need to resolve it at some point. So it's like a bit like with coding, when you open something, you will need to close it somehow. And so you have the bigger story, and then you start another one, and then maybe another one, and maybe another thread. And so at the end, you need to resolve those things as well, ideally in the same order. And so I could really see that in the resolution of the book, kind of all those threads being kind of resolved in very quick succession. And so that felt a bit too obvious to me and a bit too formulaic. One positive thing is that there is another relationship in the book. Like obviously the book centers on Jane and Joe's relationship, but there is another one that's quite important in the story that I really enjoyed. Obviously, like the topic of June having cancer is quite heavy, and Jane is struggling with a lot of different things. So overall the book is a bit on the more difficult side. It's not like a bubbly, happy kind of story, but there was this one relationship that very much felt like a breath of fresh air, and I think that really helped balancing the more difficult topics. So I really enjoyed that. I wish we would have more of that in the book, and again, same to the rest. I felt it was resolved a bit quickly in the end, when I would have wanted more time spent on this and like more development, because again, I felt other parts were a bit too slow. I think we could have balanced the ratios a little bit more. I'm maybe gonna contradict myself here, but I also felt like I wanted more from June's character. So she's the older sister, the one who has cancer and who's reaching out to Jane to get her help. I felt that she's going through something that's so difficult, so dramatic, that I wanted to have a bit more of the spotlight on her as well, and kind of understand the things she's going through, understand her experience, and have a bit more of her perspective. Which is why from the beginning I was expecting more of a dual point of view narration. So I still felt that I missed that a little bit. I wanted to see more of her internal turmoil, which is like, even through the lens of Jane, I wanted more of June's experience. And now moving on to some very spoilery thoughts. So if you haven't read the book and might want to pick it up, please skip ahead to the next section. I will have timestamps on the video so you can avoid it. And I'm gonna keep the spoiler warning on the screen. So as long as you have that on, you know that I'm giving spoilers. So I think there is a huge plot hole in that story, and it's kind of addressed at the end in passing, but it was just not satisfactory for me. So basically, June has cancer. She needs Jane's help because June got fired from a job, so she doesn't have health insurance anymore. She's stealing Jane's identity to benefit from her health insurance. And so there is this realization in the book where Jane is like, you can't die because if you die, I die, which was very dramatic. But for the rest of the book, I was like, okay, June can't die because if June dies, then legally Jane dies. But also Jane can't have children because on medical records, she will have her uterus removed, so she can't have children. And that's mentioned briefly at the end, but just like as a kind of joke or like a fun twist in a way. And I'm like, no, like that's a huge deal because if Jane has kids, they will have to pass them up for June's children, but then they won't be legally her own children. Like, do you imagine like the generational trauma that you're building in this family? It just didn't make sense to me that they would go with this in that way. So I was very frustrated by the treatment of that. And again, that felt like a huge plot hole that was not addressed in any way that was valid and satisfactory. So I was very frustrated with that. The other thing is like, I didn't understand the title. Like there is this scene where Jane is cooking eggs and she get rid of the yolk, but the scene is not given any more kind of deeper meaning, or like, at least I didn't understand it as like a metaphor for something more deep. And so it feels like the title Yolk is coming from that scene, but I'm still at a loss of what it means. And so again, I felt a bit let down on that front. If you've read this book, I'd be very curious to hear, like, how did you interpret the title? Like, did it make any sense to you? Did I miss something? Okay, done with the spoilers. In summary, I enjoyed the experience of reading this book. I thought at the micro level, it was very strong. At the macro one, there were a few things that were letting me down. So it's not a book that I will think about a lot moving forward, I think. And so it's definitely not a new favorite. I'm glad I read it. I was very curious about it, but I'm overall slightly disappointed. Next, I read Anibot by Sierra Greer. And for some reason, Amazon didn't want me to find this book. I would search for it in the search bar and it would get me to Annie Ernaux, which is like a French writer, but I couldn't get to Anibot for some reason. That was very strange. This book is about Annie, and she's obviously a robot. She's been living with this man called Doug for a couple of years, and she is initially a cuddle bunny, so she is basically a sex bot, and so she's acting as his girlfriend, living with him and cooking him meals and doing all the things that he desires. Her only goal is to please him. We follow their relationship and we are very much reading the book from the perspective of Annie. So we see her evolution through the story and how she's growing more and more intelligent and more human. She is set in autodidactic mode, so it means that she's learning more quickly than other AI bots. I really like the concept of this book and the themes that it's playing with and exploring things like what makes us human, what would make an AI human or sentient, consent, all of that. I felt was super compelling, and I would say I really loved the book until the 2/3 mark. After that, I have a slightly different view. One thing I really liked about this book is how Annie is studying him and analyzing every little tidbit that she can to adjust how she's reacting, what she's gonna say, what she's gonna do in order to please him. And I've seen some people talk about the relevance or like the parallels with some form of neurodivergence, and I can definitely understand how kind of masking and also really trying to fit in and overthinking what people are saying, how they're acting, and trying to get hints from that in order to inform your behavior can feel relatable in this book. Obviously not saying that neurodivergent people are like robots, but yeah, I really understood that point that was being made by other people whom reviews I've watched. Again, as I said, I really enjoyed the first 2/3 of this book. I thought it was very strong. I really liked the writing style, the story, the character. There were some things that I was a little bit more critical of, and so kind of entering spoiler territory now. If you want to avoid those, please skip ahead to the next section. I think the reason why I was not as engaged in the last third of the book is that it probably started too quickly. Almost immediately, we're introduced to Delta, the second robot that's coming to live with Annie and Doug. And I would have wanted a little bit more time with them and kind of understanding their lives, understanding their dynamic. And this world is familiar in a way, but it's also a very new idea that we're not familiar with, that I think the author could have spent a little bit more time kind of setting the world, setting the context before introducing this very disruptive new element that is Delta. Then I felt that the decision of Annie to leave in the middle of the book felt a bit rushed. Like, her programming is still to please Doug, so I didn't understand how she could so drastically override that and decide to run away. That was kind of surprising to me, and I think it could have been set up a little bit better. Also, that meant that we kind of reached that climax at the middle of the book, and so the rest felt less high stakes or less exciting in a way. I think for me that was very much like the climax of the book and should have come later in the story. I think obviously we see that like Doug is enough of a bad character. Just like he's done horrible things that we can understand why a normal human person would have decided to leave him at this point. But considering that, again, Annie is a robot programmed to please him, I didn't really see what pushed her over the line in this case and why that took over her programming. When she returns home with Doug after that, I didn't feel things were as engaging as before and as exciting. Like I was still very much engaged in the story. I wanted to know what happened, but I was not on the edge of my seat as much. To be honest, I was not super convinced by the ending. I didn't believe in Doug's kind of redeeming arc, and I think clearly the point is not to redeem him. It's just like an awful human being, and that's still very, very clear. But like he changes so much, like going from wanting to get rid of her and being just like absolutely awful and violent and abusive to her to wanting to have children. That felt a bit kind of out of the blue. So like the change was just too sudden for me to be believable. But I understand that we needed that to get to the ending that the author wanted, but it all felt a little bit too contrived for me to be believable and felt shoehorned in to get where the author wanted to go. I was just not on board with that. The thing though that I felt was very well done in this book, it was the relationship between Annie and Delta when they went on the road. I think you could clearly see the difference between the two and how much more advanced Annie was compared to Delta, how much more human she was. And I think that was very clever seeing that contrast, but also their relationship and the way that Annie's perceiving Delta and in a way gets attached to her was very moving and really touching. I would have wanted more of that. And again, seeing more of that progression, because I think there were times where it was very subtle and very well done and very smartly done, but other times the kind of character arcs or the character evolutions was a bit rushed and a bit too forced in to be believable for me. That includes Annie's rage at the end. Like again, obviously from everything she's experienced with Doug, you would understand that she's like mad at him, and the level of rage that she feels for him I think is very understandable and legitimate. But again, I didn't see that enough underneath. Again, she was programmed to be pleasing him, and we see that until the end, until kind of he releases her. And I would have really liked if it had been foreshadowed more, and if we could see at times how her own feelings, like the emotion that she started to develop, contradicts her programming, and how that's creating like some bugs, and where maybe like it's creating glitches in her the way she behaves and things like that. I would have wanted to see that more. Maybe it was there and I was reading this book too quickly because I devoured it in, again, a very short amount of time. So again, it's like it was a very good book. I quite enjoyed it, but there were still things that I felt could have been stronger. So I'm nitpicking here. Moving on from spoilers now, I really enjoyed this book. I thought, again, I felt it was a very strong book. I really appreciate what it was trying to do. There was just parts that I think could have been stronger for me in terms of structure, in terms of character development, but overall, yeah, really strong. I really enjoyed it. So I would recommend, and I would be very curious to hear what you think. If you've read it and watched the spoiler section, do you agree with me? Do you disagree? How did you perceive those points? I'd be very curious to know. Let me know in the comments below. Finally, I read This Is How You Lose the Time War by Amal El-Mohtar and Max Gladstone. This is what you could probably qualify as a literary sci-fi. So we are following Red and Blue, who are two agents working from opposite sides of a global war. And the way they operate is that they go through threads of time to influence the events that happened at some point in time and making those events kind of tip the balance in favor of their camp or against the other camp. They are often pitched against each other, and so through their different missions they start exchanging letters, and through those letters start falling in love. The book is structured to alternate between short narrative chapters and then the letters that the two characters exchange. And so for one section you follow Red and then get one of her letters, and then you follow Blue and get one of her letters. So you alternate narration and letters, but you also alternate between the two characters. Before reading this book, I had heard only good things, like people seem to love this. And so I was expecting to adore this book because I love beautiful prose and what you would call like purple prose with like lots of imagery and all of that. So I really wanted to like this, and I have to say I absolutely didn't. I kind of hate it actually, and Ellen had to blackmail me to finish it. So I'm very sad about it, but I just couldn't get into it. I don't understand the hype, and I'm sorry if you loved it, and good for you, honestly. Like, I wanted to love it, so I'm kind of jealous if you did. And maybe don't watch the rest of my review because I'm not very kind to this book. It's very short, it's barely 200 pages, and yet it felt like it dragged on so long. I don't understand how such a short book can feel like so long and such a pain to get through. I think the main reason people love this is for the writing. It is indeed very purpley, like very image heavy, and the thing is that it didn't work for me. It felt like the prose was too much in love with itself, trying to be clever, and it just felt, to be honest, quite pretentious to me. It was overwritten to the point that it was unreadable at points for me. I just would read a chapter and then would be like, what did I just read? Like, would not understand what was going on. It's just very obscure at some point and trying to be, again, too clever, using lots of metaphors to the point that you're not exactly sure on what you understand. In the same way that for some fantasy writing or speculative writing, like, you suspend your disbelief, I think the people who like this book were able to suspend the need to understand everything, so they were able to let go and just let them flow in the writing. And so I really admire that. I really tried to do that, but at some point it just felt like empty writing again, and just saying a lot of complicated words without really having any meaning or depth to it. I love beautiful writing and purpley prose, but it needs to make sense. Like, it needs to have a purpose, and I didn't feel any purpose in the level of complexity in the writing in this book. It was just pretty for the sake of being pretty, and even that, I felt that at times the tone was not consistent. Like, you would have this kind of timeless way of writing with, again, like beautiful imagery, and at some point you did have beautiful writing, but at other times you would get modern references, or like you would break the kind of tone of the prose and start getting expressions that didn't really fit. And I think the point was to be a little bit humorous, but it very much felt like an inside joke between the writers that I was very much excluded from. And so that was kind of frustrating and taking me out of the story. To give an example on that, there is this scene about an owl, and the book goes on to say, its wizard face inclined to her, the sheen of its feathers ruffling a color like the retreating night. Beautiful language, beautiful writing, love this. And then you go on to, then it orcs up a sizable pellet. And if you don't know, I didn't. A pellet is basically the bird version of a cat furball. And so the letter that the character is retrieving is in that pellet. So basically it's just like the remains of like the mice the owl ate and stuff like that. It's just gross. And so I don't understand that kind of contrast, and what's the point? Again, it's supposed to be funny, I believe, but I was just like, eh. The other main reason I think the book was really hard to understand and keep immersed in is that even though it's written by two different writers and you are reading from two different characters with very different perspectives, very different stories, like they're supposed to be quite night and day and quite opposite. When you read it, you can't distinguish between red and blue. Like you can't see the difference. Like, it's really hard to remember which one you're reading. And so that's due to, again, the style of the writing, which is very kind of similar-ish all through. Like I had a hard time distinguishing between the different voice, but it's also sadly due to the fact that the characters felt very empty and very superficial. You don't really learn anything about who they are. They didn't have strong, distinctive voices nor personality, and there was not any depth to them, which was very frustrating. The problem with that is that if we're seeing their letters and we don't really understand who they are, what makes them tick, what makes them interesting people, that very much begs the question of how do they fall in love? It just didn't feel believable for me at all, because I was just like not invested in any of them. I couldn't tell who they were as people, and obviously also because I was not invested in the characters, that meant I was not really invested in the story. Then looking into the plot, which is a bit spoilery territory, so skip ahead if you don't want to listen to that part. Because it's a time travel story, I very much expected time travel to be the solution to their problem, because obviously they are from opposing camps, so they need to hide their relationship and they're in constant fear of being caught, and you have this kind of looming presence following them. For me, it was obvious from the very beginning that it was one of them kind of covering their tracks. So that was not a surprise, and obviously the exact nature of the twist I didn't necessarily see coming, but it was kind of obvious that time travel was what was going to get them out of trouble. And so when Blue dies, well, first of all, I was not attached to the character, so the punch didn't carry any weight, and also it didn't feel like it had really any stakes, because again, it's a time travel story, so obviously they're going to fix it and find a way to change the time trajectory. Overall, I think it's a really, really cool concept, and I really like the idea. I think it was very intriguing and very engaging. Unfortunately, the execution was just not there for me, and I really wanted to love this, but I really struggled to make my way through it. And Ellen, if you watch her video with the review, she found a little something in the book that was really, really cute and really nice. And so she told me about it. I was really curious. I wanted to know what it was. And so she had to blackmail me and tell me, I will tell you if you finish the book what it is. And so that's how I managed to finish the book. That's the only reason, because I was curious of what she found in her book. But in summary, a book can, for me, shine in different ways. You can have beautiful writing, you can have really moving characters that you get super engaged about and really love and want to see what happens to them, or you can have super compelling plot and world building. And I felt like in this book there was literally no character building. The world is very vague. You don't really understand what the war is about, what are the stakes, how do you win, how do you lose, what are they fighting for. You don't have any information about that. So the world building was very blurry and you don't have anything to grasp to keep your attention going. And so the only thing that was left, and that I think is again the reason some people absolutely adore this book, is the writing. But as I described, it didn't really work for me. It felt all incredibly superficial and self-indulgent. And so it was thin on characters, world building, and then the writing was not working for me. So there was just like barely anything left for me to keep going. So yeah, overall, I kind of hated the experience of reading this book, and I'm gonna unhaul it. Those are all the books I read in July, and if you're still here, thank you very much, because I think it's probably going to be a very long and rambly video. I hope you had a lovely reading month. Let me know in the comments which was your favorite book this month. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.